The wind howled across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga in November of 1941, whipping snow into blinding swirls that obscured the horizon. A lone convoy of trucks crept cautiously onto the treacherous ice, which groaned and cracked under the weight of the desperate cargo. Drivers kept their doors open despite the sub-zero temperatures, ready to jump if their vehicles plunged into the black freezing water below. This was the road of life, and it was the only slender thread connecting the besieged city of Leningrad to the rest of the Soviet Union. German artillery shells exploded nearby, sending geysers of ice and water into the gray sky, but the convoy pressed on. Every sack of flour and crate of ammunition carried by these brave souls meant another day of survival for millions trapped within the Iron Ring. Inside the city limits, the situation had deteriorated into a nightmare of biblical proportions as the Nazi war machine tightened its chokehold. The German Army Group North had severed all land connections by September 8, 1941, effectively sealing the doom of the city. Food reserves were critically low, and the bombing of the Badyev warehouses had incinerated tons of sugar and grain, creating a sweet-smelling smoke that haunted the starving populace. Electricity was cut off, leaving the magnificent palaces and apartment blocks dark and freezing as the harshest winter in decades descended. Residents burned furniture and books in small stove heaters just to keep the blood flowing in their veins. The once vibrant cultural capital of Russia was transforming into a ghostly landscape of snow and silence. Adolf Hitler had issued a directive that left no room for ambiguity or mercy regarding the fate of Leningrad and its inhabitants. He declared that the city must be wiped from the face of the earth and that no capitulation would be accepted even if offered. The plan was not merely to conquer, but to eradicate the population through starvation and cold, ensuring that the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution vanished forever. This was a war of annihilation where civilians were the primary targets and hunger was the weapon of choice. The stakes were absolute as the survival of an entire culture and history hung in the balance. If Leningrad fell, it would allow the German forces to swing south and potentially encircle Moscow, ending the war in the east. Amidst this apocalyptic landscape stood figures of immense resilience who refused to let the spirit of the city die. One such figure was the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, who remained in the besieged city during the early months, serving as a volunteer firefighter. By day, he dug trenches and watched for incendiary bombs on the roof of the conservatory, and by night he worked feverishly on his Seventh Symphony. He wrote music that would capture the terror of the invasion and the unyielding courage of the people. His weapon was not a rifle, but a musical score that would eventually rally the starving population and broadcast their defiance to the world. He represented the soul of Leningrad, a refusal to be silenced by the roar of cannons. The question that hung over every frozen street and dark apartment was whether the human spirit could endure such calculated cruelty. Could a city of 3 million people survive on a ration of 125 grams of bread made from sawdust and wallpaper paste? As the temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero and the daily death toll rose to the thousands, the world watched with bated breath. Observers wondered if the city would dissolve into anarchy and cannibalism, or if the discipline of the citizens would hold. It was a test of endurance that had no parallel in modern history, asking how much suffering a human being could withstand before breaking completely. Life in Leningrad shrank to the primal pursuit of calories and warmth as the blockade stretched into weeks and then months. People moved slowly through the streets wrapped in layers of rags, their faces dark with soot and frostbite. The trams had stopped running, leaving the city eerily quiet, except for the metronome beat broadcast over loudspeakers to prove the radio was still working. Water pipes burst, forcing exhausted women and children to fetch water from holes cut in the ice of the Neva River. They dragged sleds carrying buckets of water, and often the wrapped bodies of their loved ones who had succumbed to the hunger. Death became so commonplace that it lost its ability to shock, leaving only a dull, persistent ache. The daily bread ration became the most precious object in the universe for the trapped citizens of Leningrad. Bakers worked under armed guard to produce loaves that were black and heavy, damp with moisture, and filled with inedible fillers. To lose a ration card was a death sentence, and theft was punished with immediate execution by roving patrols. Mothers divided the tiny crusts among their children, watching their eyes grow larger in shrinking faces. The pangs of hunger were constant, a gnawing emptiness that consumed thoughts and dreams alike. People boiled leather belts and scraped the glue off wallpaper to make a nutritious soup in a desperate attempt to trick their stomachs. Tanya Savicheva was a young girl whose diary would later become a tragic symbol of the suffering endured by the children of Leningrad. In a small notebook, she recorded the dates and times of the deaths of her family members one by one. Her entries were stark and factual, devoid of emotion, because she had no energy left for tears. Grandmother died, then uncle, then mother, until Tanya wrote that only she remained. Her simple handwritten notes captured the slow, systematic extinction of a family unit under the pressure of the blockade. It was a testament to the quiet horror unfolding behind thousands of closed doors across the city. Despite the overwhelming misery, the city refused to surrender its humanity or its cultural identity. Theaters continued to operate sporadically, with actors fainting from hunger during performances. The public library remained open, where shivering scholars studied by candlelight wrapped in coats and gloves. Scientists at the Vavilov Institute of Plant Industry chose to starve to death rather than eat the precious collection of seeds they were guarding for the future. They understood that their survival was secondary to the preservation of knowledge and the potential to feed future generations. This intellectual resistance was as vital as the military defense on the perimeter. The road of life across Lake Ladoga evolved into a sophisticated logistical operation despite the constant shelling. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on the ice to protect the trucks, and traffic controllers waved lanterns in the dark to guide drivers around fresh bomb craters. In addition to food coming in, the trucks took evacuees out on the return journey. Hundreds of thousands of children, the elderly, and the sick were transported across the frozen lake to safety. Many died on the journey, their weakened bodies unable to withstand the freezing wind on the open trucks. Yet the road remained the artery that kept the heart of Leningrad beating through the terrible winter. Spring of 1942 brought a thaw that revealed the true scale of the tragedy hidden by the snow. The city mobilized the survivors to clean the streets and prevent epidemics from the thawing bodies. Emaciated women and teenagers wielded shovels and brooms with the last of their strength. The trams began to run again, a symbol of returning order that lifted the morale of the populace. Vegetable gardens were planted in every available patch of dirt, including public parks and roundabouts. The people of Leningrad were adapting, turning their city into a fortress of survival, where every cabbage grown was a victory against the Nazis. The premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942 was a psychological turning point for the city. The orchestra was depleted by starvation, so the conductor Karl Eliasberg had to recruit musicians from the front lines. They rehearsed with trembling hands, their brass instruments failing to sound because their lungs were too weak. On the day of the concert, the Soviet artillery launched a massive barrage to silence the German guns. The music was broadcast over loudspeakers towards the German lines, a sonic declaration that Leningrad was still alive. It was a moment of transcendent defiance that shook the confidence of the besiegers. By January 1943, the Soviet military command had devised a plan known as Operation Iskra to break the blockade. The strategy involved a coordinated attack from the Leningrad front inside the ring and the Volkhov front outside. The goal was to create a land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. The terrain was difficult, consisting of frozen swamps and dense forests heavily fortified by the Germans. Soldiers trained in winter warfare prepared to assault the entrenched positions, knowing that failure meant the continued starvation of the city. The air was thick with the tension of an impending battle that would decide the fate of millions. The battle for the breach began with a deafening artillery barrage that tore through the German fortifications. Soviet infantry surged across the frozen Neva River under heavy machine gun fire. The fighting was brutal in close quarters, often devolving into hand-to-hand combat in the snowy trenches. Tanks struggled through the peat bogs, their treads churning the black earth as they supported the advance. For 7 days, the two fronts pushed towards each other, driven by the desperate need to reconnect Leningrad with the mainland. The sound of battle could be heard in the city center, giving hope to the citizens huddling in their basements. On January 18, 1943, the two Soviet fronts met near the settlements of Worker Settlements No. 1 and 5. Soldiers from the inside and outside embraced with tears in their eyes, realizing they had finally pierced the iron ring. The blockade was technically broken, although the corridor they opened was only a few miles wide. It was a narrow strip of land constantly under German fire, but it was enough to build a railway line. This victory was celebrated with jubilation in Leningrad, even as the shelling continued. The psychological stranglehold had been broken, and the end of the nightmare was in sight. The construction of the railway line through the newly liberated corridor was a feat of incredible engineering and bravery. It was built in just 17 days under direct observation and fire from German artillery positions. Workers nicknamed it the Corridor of Death because of the high casualty rate among the railway crews. Yet the first train carrying food and supplies arrived in Leningrad in February 1943. The sight of a locomotive pulling wagons of grain into the Finland station brought people to their knees in gratitude. The worst of the famine was over, although the war was far from finished. For another year, the city remained under siege and subject to intense artillery bombardment and air raids. The Germans were furious at the breach and poured thousands of shells into the residential districts. Citizens learned to walk on the safer side of the street, where warning signs were painted on the walls. Schools operated in bomb shelters and factories continued to produce weapons for the front. The resilience of Leningrad had hardened into a grim determination to see the invaders destroyed. The city had become a fortress of steel and stone that would not yield. In January 1944, the Soviet army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive to fully lift the siege. A massive concentration of troops, tanks, and artillery was assembled to drive the German army group north away from the city walls. The offensive began with a thunderous barrage that surpassed anything seen before in the war. German defenses crumbled under the weight of the assault, and they were forced to retreat in disarray. The blockade that had lasted for 872 days was finally and completely lifted. The guns that had tormented the city for years were silenced or captured. The reveal of the aftermath was a landscape of devastation and a population forever changed by their ordeal. Over 600,000 people had died of starvation, alone a number that exceeded the combined American and British casualties of the entire war. The Piskaryevskoye Memorial Cemetery became the final resting place for 500,000 victims buried in mass graves. The city had survived, but the cost was etched into the faces of every survivor and the walls of every building. It was a victory won through unimaginable suffering and sacrifice. Leningrad was named a hero city of the Soviet Union, a title that acknowledged its unique contribution to the victory over fascism. The survivors bore their physical and mental scars with a quiet dignity, rebuilding their city from the ruins. The palaces were restored to their former glory, and the parks were replanted with trees. But beneath the fresh paint and new plaster, the memory of the blockade remained. It was present in the silence of the older generation and the reverence for bread that persisted for decades. The city became a living monument to the strength of the human spirit. The Nuremberg trials later exposed the explicit intent of the Nazi leadership to starve the city into submission. Documents revealed the orders to reject surrender and the calculation of calories needed to ensure death. The siege was classified as a war crime and a crime against humanity. The world learned the full extent of the horror that had taken place on the banks of the Neva. It served as a grim reminder of the depths of cruelty possible in war. Justice was sought for the victims, but no verdict could bring back the lost souls. The legacy of the siege transcends national borders and political ideologies, standing as a universal story of endurance. It teaches us about the capacity of ordinary people to withstand extraordinary hardship. The diary of Tanya Savicheva and the Seventh Symphony of Shostakovich remain powerful artifacts of that time. They remind us that even in the darkest moments, art and love can survive. The story of Leningrad is a testament to the will to live against all odds. It is a narrative that demands to be remembered. In the decades that followed the siege, became a central pillar of the identity of the city, now known as St. Petersburg. Every year on January 27th, the city marks the anniversary of the lifting of the blockade. Sirens sound across the city, and people lay flowers at the memorial sites. It is a day of mourning and pride, a time to reflect on the price of freedom. The younger generations are taught the history so that the suffering of their ancestors is never forgotten. The city honors its dead by living and thriving. The question of how the city survived finds its answer in the collective will of its people. It was not just the military strategy or the ice road that saved Leningrad, but the refusal of individuals to give up. It was the librarian who protected the books, the musician who played the trumpet with frozen lips, and the mother who gave her last crumb to her child. These small acts of heroism woven together created an unbreakable barrier against the enemy. The city stood because its people stood together. Their unity was their strongest armor. Visitors to St. Petersburg today can still see the traces of the siege if they know where to look. The warning signs about artillery fire have been preserved on some buildings as historical markers. The scars on the granite embankments and the shrapnel marks on the statues tell a silent story. The museums display the tiny ration of bread and the sleds used to transport water. These physical reminders serve to ground the modern city in its tragic past. They ensure that the whisper of time continues to speak to those who pass by. The Badaev warehouse's site remains a poignant location in the geography of the siege memory. The soil there was said to remain sweet with melted sugar for years after the fire. Desperate children would dig up the earth to taste the sweetness mixed with dirt and ash. It is a stark image of the desperation that defined the era. Such stories are passed down through families, preserving the personal histories alongside the official narrative. The oral history of the siege is as important as the written records. The role of women in the defense and survival of Leningrad cannot be overstated in any account of the blockade. With so many men at the front, women took over the factories, the civil defense, and the households. They dug the anti-tank ditches, cleared the rubble, and cared for the dying. They were the backbone of the resistance, holding the social fabric together when it threatened to disintegrate. Their strength and endurance were the foundation upon which the survival of the city rested. Monuments in the city specifically honor the mothers and daughters of the siege. Cats have a special place in the history of the siege and the restoration of the city. During the famine, the cat population was decimated as people were forced to eat them to survive. This led to a plague of rats that threatened the food supplies and the art collections in the Hermitage. After the siege was broken, trainloads of cats were brought in from Siberia and other regions to hunt the rats. These cats are honored today as the saviors of the museum treasures. It is a unique and touching chapter in the grim saga. The medical staff of Leningrad performed miracles under the most appalling conditions imaginable. Hospitals operated without heat, electricity, or running water, and medicines were in short supply. Surgeons operated by the light of oil lamps with their breath freezing in the air. They treated not only combat wounds, but the devastating effects of dystrophy and frostbite. Many doctors and nurses died of exhaustion and starvation while caring for their patients. Their dedication to their duty remains a shining example of medical ethics. The blockade also saw the evacuation of industrial machinery and cultural treasures to the east. Before the ring closed, thousands of train cars carried away the most valuable assets of the city. What remained had to be protected by the citizens who stayed behind. The Hermitage staff lived in the museum cellars, guarding the empty frames and the building itself from damage. They maintained the climate conditions as best they could to protect the walls and floors. It was a labor of love for the cultural heritage of their nation. As the war moved west and Berlin eventually fell, the survivors of Leningrad began the long process of healing. The physical rebuilding was rapid, but the psychological recovery took generations. The trauma of the starvation left a permanent mark on the physiology and psychology of the survivors. Many suffered from long-term health issues related to the famine. Yet they also carried a profound appreciation for life and peace. Their experience created a unique bond among the people of the city. The unspeakable suffering of a city under Nazi blockade is not just a title, but a factual description of reality. The word unspeakable refers to the horrors that were too terrible to verbalize at the time. Yet history demands that we speak of them now to honor those who endured. We must articulate the pain and the loss to understand the magnitude of the event. Silence would be a disservice to the memory of the victims. We tell their story to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. Today, the city of St. Petersburg stands as a beautiful and vibrant metropolis on the Baltic Sea. The canals reflect the golden spires, and the palaces are filled with tourists from around the world. But beneath the surface of this modern elegance lies the bedrock of heroic endurance. The city is built not just on piles driven into the swamp, but on the bones and courage of its defenders. It is a city that looked into the abyss and refused to blink. That is its eternal glory. In the quiet corners of the Piskaryevskoy cemetery, the eternal flame burns as a constant vigil for the fallen. The long rows of mounds mark the mass graves where hundreds of thousands lie together. It is a place of profound silence and heavy atmosphere where the scale of the loss becomes tangible. Visitors walk softly along the paths, feeling the weight of history in the air. It is here that the true cost of the siege is most deeply felt. The earth itself seems to mourn. The Siege of Leningrad remains one of the most harrowing episodes in the history of warfare and human endurance. It challenges our understanding of what is possible when survival is the only option. It shows the depths of depravity in the besiegers and the heights of nobility in the besieged. The story serves as a beacon of hope and a warning for future generations. As long as the city stands, the memory of those 872 days will live on. The whisper of time carries their voices to us across the decades.